Hello, I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I am the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this fall's Marcus Bierich lecture in the humanities entitled The Moral Triangle, Germans, Israelis, Palestinians in Berlin. This event, which it was a somewhat late addition to our schedule, began with an invitation to Katharina Galor to be the fall 2020 Marcus Bierich visitor in the humanities at the American Academy. And this distinguished visitorship was established in order to bring important scholarship and academic debate to a broader audience in Berlin and wherever people can access the American Academy. It's had a very distinguished tradition and some really remarkable speakers who have been at the Hans Arnold Center, who include Francis Fukuyama, Adam Tooze, Tricia Rose, Stephen Greenblatt, Judith Wexler, and others. As I mentioned, it began with an invitation to Katharina Galor. The lecture was supposed to take place at the American Academy in Berlin because she is in fact in Berlin and enjoying the comfortable surroundings of our partner institution, the Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin. But we changed the format due to the situation involving the pandemic. And she suggested bringing her co-author, Said Atshan, on board, who agreed, and we're delighted is joining us from Berkeley, California, where I imagine it's considerably more pleasant at the moment than it is in chilly Berlin. So good morning to you, Said, and I'm delighted that we could have the two of you as co-Bierich fellows. I also want to introduce our discussant tonight, Gürce Yurdakul, who is here in Berlin as well. She is the Georg Simmel Professor of Diversity and Social Conflict at the Humboldt University here in Berlin and chair of a research cluster in the Berlin Institute of Migration and Integration Research. She is the author of a number of important works on issues of integration. Unfortunately, sorry for that, some of the pages got away from me. Her most recent book is The Headscarf Debates, Conflicts of National Belonging, which she wrote with Anna Korteweg, and which came out in 2014, was published by Stanford University Press. Her research has been supported by the German-Israeli Foundation, the Berlin University Alliance, and the German Center for Migration and Integration Research, among others. Last year in 2019, Yurdakul was a Weatherhead Scholar at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. She is the co-chair of the Immigration Research Network at the Council for European Studies. Gürce, thank you so much for joining us and for moderating, both for discussing with Katharina and Said, and also for moderating the Q&A after. And let me just tell our viewers that once the talk begins, feel free to send in your questions through the Q&A function in your Zoom screen down on the lower right. And Gürce will get to them as best she can. I'm sure we won't get to all of them tonight, but I know she'll do her best to cover as many of them as possible. Do not hit the raise your hand function if that is available on your screen, because we will not be able to call on anyone. And with that, Gürce, I'm delighted to hand it over to you. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here. I will start with introducing Katharina Galor and Said Atshan. Katharina is an art historian and archaeologist, specializing in the visual and material culture of Israel-Palestine. She's currently, as Daniel just mentioned, the visiting Hirschfeld Associate Professor at Brown University, with a joint appointment in the program of Judaic Studies and the program of Urban Studies. Galor has also taught at Hebrew University, École Bibliothèque et Archéologique Français in Jerusalem, Tufts University, Rhode Island School of Design, and most recently at the Humboldt University in Berlin, where I had the pleasure to meet Katharina. Her publications include The Archaeology of Jerusalem, From the Origins to the Ottomans, co-authored with Hans-Ford Blödhahn, Yale University Press in 2013. Finding Jerusalem, Archaeology Between Science and Ideology came out more recently in 2017 by University of California Press. And with Said Atshan, the book that we will be discussing and hearing today. She's currently at work on Jewish Women, Portraits of Conformity and Agency, a project supported by a grant from the Leo Baeck Institute in Berlin. It's nice to see you again, Kathy. Said Atshan. Said Atshan is an assistant professor of peace and conflict studies at Swarthmore College. He's spending the 2020-21 academic year as a visiting professor of anthropology and visiting scholar in Middle Eastern Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Atshan previously served as a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute for International Studies at Brown University. He earned a joint PhD in anthropology and Middle Eastern studies and an MA in social anthropology from Harvard University and a master in public policy degree from the Harvard Kennedy School. He received his BA from Swarthmore in 2006. Atshan's research interests are the intersection of peace and conflict studies, the anthropology of policy, critical development studies, and gender and sexuality studies. He has two recent books, both of which were published in 2020. Queer Palestine and the Empire of Critique came out from Stanford University Press, and the co-authored book that we will discuss today. Atshan has been awarded multiple grants and fellowships, including from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Open Society Foundation, National Science Foundation, Social Science Research Council, Woodrow Wilson National Foundation, and the list goes on like this. He's also the recipient of Paul and Daisy Soros Fellowship and a Catherine Davis Fellowship for Peace. He has worked for the American Civil Liberties Union and the United Nations High Commission of Refugees, Human Rights Watch, Seed of Peace, the Palestinian Negotiations Affairs Department, and the government of Dubai. He's also a Palestinian, Quaker, and LGBTQ human rights activist. It's wonderful to see you again, Said. So I would like to open the presentation, The Moral Triangle, Germans, Israelis, Palestinians in Berlin, came out from Duke University Press. I'm looking forward to the presentation, and then I will ask some questions, which I have prepared for you, and we will open the floor for discussion. The floor is yours.
So first of all, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Dan Benjamin for inviting us to present our co-authored book, The Moral Triangle, Germans, Israelis, Palestinians, and also to Berit Ebert and Johanna Gallup, who in their usual efficiency have made sure that we can make this happen despite the current challenges. Thank you also to Götzsche, Professor Yurdakul, for reading our book and for moderating this event, and I believe the Q&A after our short presentation. Now, the reason that presenting our joint project on this virtual platform of the American Academy feels very special to me is that it is actually within the very walls of this institution that I began to think of this project. And the idea to explore the Israeli and Palestinian communities in the city of Berlin came to us in 2016 when I temporarily moved to Berlin. Already before coming here, I had read about the relatively recent and massive migration of Israelis to the city. And once I got settled, I also learned about the even more significant Palestinian community here. And so I suggested to Saed to write a short paper on these two communities and also on their relationship with Germans who all live in this very vibrant city. that, however, still very much lives under the clouds of the past. And as we started to systematically follow the media coverage in the German, the English, the Hebrew and Arabic press, everything that was, of course, related to the subject areas we intended to explore. And also as we try to systematically, not systematically, but to read up on all the existing scholarship on these two communities in Germany, we very quickly came to realize that this topic and the data were incredibly rich and also incredibly complex. And so the short article we intended to write initially very quickly expanded into this book-long manuscript. So here we see the cover of our co-authored book. It came out in May, as Götschke said, and for marketing purposes that are very specific to the US and English readership, the word Berlin is not mentioned in the title, but it is all about the city, of course. So we are very excited to be able to share with you also our latest news. We were just informed that the book will be translated into German, thanks to a grant by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And we're thrilled that Professor Dr. Koku von Stuckart, a professor of religious studies, who's the author and translators of numerous books, will translate our English version. And the publisher is De Gruyter, and the plan is that it will come out in the late spring or early summer of next year. And the title of the German version is Israelis, Palästinenser und Deutsche in Berlin, Geschichten einer komplizierten Beziehung.
So I would like to really echo Kati's gratitude to the organizers of our event and to all of you for joining us and being with us. It's a tremendous pleasure to be able to be in conversation with all of you. I must admit that this is the talk I've been looking forward to the most. We've given many talks all across the US, different parts of the world. We've given talks in Berlin in the past, but this is our first event addressed to a Berlin-based audience since the publishing of the book. And we both have tremendous respect for the American Academy in Berlin and all of the work that you and your community do and the vibrancy of your intellectual community. So thank you again for having us. You're familiar with the Berlin context, so we're not going to emphasize the Berlin context too much. But what I want to quickly do is just share a little bit about how Kati and I met. We were both at Brown University. I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Watson Institute, and Kati is a faculty member in the Judaic Studies program. And we met at a panel on the Gaza conflict in the context of the war in 2014. And then very quickly, soon thereafter, Kati's Palestinian friend Reem and my Jewish friend Hannah insisted that we meet and that we become friends. So they actually arranged a wonderful tea social event, and the four of us got together and we just very quickly became dear colleagues and dear friends and collaborators. And that's how this book was born. And we think that this exploration of the moral triangle that connects Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians, it's a beautiful way to bring it together, to have a German-Israeli scholar who's Kati and a Palestinian scholar, myself, collaborate in producing this work. Kati, you're on mute.
Thank you. So I was born and raised in Germany as the daughter of Holocaust survivors. My parents came to Germany as refugees from Eastern Europe and settled in Düsseldorf after spending some time first in France and then in Belgium. And I myself spent much of my teens and also young adulthood in Israel, ultimately moving to Israel and taking on Israeli citizenship at the age of 21. And Saed was raised in the West Bank under Israeli military occupation. And then, as Götschke already mentioned, Saed moved to the US for his college and university education and also professional career. a move that, however, allowed him to maintain a very close connection to his home with regular visits and also continued educational and research activities. So we basically have lived on two opposite sides of the wall and grew up in very different cultural, national, and also religious contexts. And we experienced the conflict, the wars, the Second Intifada, and also the military occupation from two very different perspectives. Now, I should say that despite these differences, we found ourselves in, I would say, sustained political agreement throughout the course of our work, throughout the course of our collaboration, as we were preparing the research, as we were conducting the interviews, and also throughout the writing process. Methodologically, we integrated historical and anthropological tools using the so-called snowball method, one of the more popular methods of sampling in qualitative research, conducting altogether some 100 interviews. And half of these interviews were formal, semi-structured, for which we used questionnaires. And the other half were informal encounters and meetings, most of them, of course, scheduled ahead of time. And during this period of our interviews, we also attended a number of lectures in the city, academic and cultural events, festivals, activist meetings, and also a couple of demonstrations. And so we met most of our interlocutors in cafes or restaurants, in bars and offices, in their homes, in the streets, and cab and U-Bahn and S-Bahn rides were particularly productive. That's where we actually collected some of the more powerful quotes you can read in our book. Our subjects were about 1/3 German, 1/3 Israelis, and 1/3 Palestinians, ranging anywhere from undocumented refugees to bartenders, hairdressers, teachers, artists, politicians, and so on and so forth. And so what we were trying to do is basically to get a good and representative sample of the populations we engaged in our study. And these populations were obviously internally diverse. And what I should add is also that people really seem to speak to us with surprising candor, but only 6 out of 100 agreed to have their names mentioned. Our first book chapter deals with the traumas, the memories, and also the consequences of the Holocaust and the Nakba, and specifically with how Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians think about and experience these very different, but also clearly related historical events. And we looked, of course, at how these chapters play out in Berlin's urban and also human landscape. This, by the way, is a picture we took of Gunther Demnig as he and one of his assistants were placing a number of Stolpersteine into the pavement of one of Mitte's tree-lined avenues. Now, without going into detail, Germany is doing really a remarkable job at educating the public on the Holocaust, young and old, citizens, residents and tourists at school, in the media, in the streets. And interestingly, the Nakba is a term that is not familiar to most Germans, including highly educated Germans, and is clearly not a historical event or process that is integrated into the mainstream public discourse or into the official school curriculum, nor into the urban landscape.
So we'd like to share a bit about how we think about the categories of victim and perpetrator. And we really do want to complicate these analytical categories because we recognize that it's possible for a subject to simultaneously serve as a victim and as a perpetrator, and that there's a lot of complexity, and that these domains that we're examining are morally fraught. And we really worked very hard in terms of capturing that nuance. What we also found, which was quite refreshing, was that overwhelmingly there was a willingness to think critically about some of the mainstream and hegemonic discourses on who's a victim and who's a perpetrator, especially as advanced by the Israeli government and in some cases by the German government. But we also found that there is tremendous cognizance of the weight of the Holocaust, of the victimhood of Jewish victims of the Holocaust and other victims of the Holocaust. And across our interviewees, the Germans, the Israelis, and the Palestinians, that was very palpable and very heartwarming to us as well. There was also tremendous recognition, especially among the Israelis and the Palestinians, of Israel's military occupation of the Palestinian territories and the kinds of dynamics that that has created both in the past and in the present.
Now, to contextualize the political and also social context of our study, we investigated the historical development of Germany's relationship with Israel-Palestine, how it evolved after Konrad Adenauer and David Ben-Gurion established the first diplomatic ties in the 1960s, how Germany has supported the Israeli military industry, Germany's commitment to humanitarian aid to the Palestinians in the occupied territories and the Gaza Strip, their involvement or sometimes also their lack thereof with the conflict, and also the concept of Israel as a raison d'etat of the Federal Republic. And at the focus for us was how to engage the question of past crimes with present responsibilities towards both Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East, and of course towards Israelis and Palestinian migrants in Germany and Berlin more specifically. And also on how the different interlocutors we interviewed thought about all of these issues. This, by the way, is an image of Günter Schäfer's huge Berlin Wall mural, which is located at the East Side Gallery and is entitled Vaterland. It's originally from 1990, and it usually only shows the German and Israeli flags. The Palestinian flag that we see here was only very briefly superimposed in a so-called peace action in 2004.
So it's really important to understand the Israeli and Palestinian communities in Berlin within the overall context of the history of migration in Germany and its reverberations in the present moment. So we can think about, for example, the 1960s and the arrival of guest workers, migrant workers in Berlin and many parts of all across Germany, as well as the recent, 2015 migration of close to 1 million refugees to Germany and the kind of contestation that resulted because of that. And also the kinds of differences between discourse surrounding migration at the state level, as well as at the civil society level and the grassroots level. So we were incredibly heartened to find this tremendous welcoming culture of welcoming refugees and migrants, especially in Berlin. It was so beautiful to see these displays of solidarity all across the city. It was absolutely heartwarming. And it was also disconcerting to witness the rise of the AfD and other xenophobic right-wing movements that are really drawing upon xenophobia and anti-refugee and anti-migrant sentiments in order to further their right-wing agendas. We had devoted a chapter of the book on this, what we call this elusive demography. It's very hard to actually get a precise figure at how many Israelis are in Berlin today, how many Palestinians are in Berlin today. The Israeli estimates range anywhere between 10 to 40,000, and the Palestinian estimates range anywhere between 40 to 85,000. After really rigorous research and interviews and data collection, what the conclusion we came to is that there are about 25,000 Israelis in Berlin today and about 60,000 Palestinians living in Berlin today. So the Palestinian community is about double, a little more than double the Israeli community, but they're both very vibrant, very large diaspora communities in the city of Berlin. And we think it's really important to understand them in conversation with one another, in dialogue with one another, even with the complications of citizenship, because many Israelis carry many forms of citizenship, and Palestinians maybe don't have citizenship or also carry different forms of citizenship, whether European or Middle Eastern. So citizenship alone doesn't allow us to get at this politics of statistics, as we call it. Now, one of the themes we explore as well is this idea of Berlin as a new home for these Israelis and Palestinians. And so we rely on our interviews, as Kati mentioned, on existing scholarship, journalistic accounts. And what we find is that there's tremendous attention on this very exciting and fascinating and in some ways ironic Israeli migration to the city of Berlin. For a lot of people, it's counterintuitive that so many Israelis, especially young Israelis, would choose to move to Germany of all places, given the history and the relations between these communities. But there isn't as much attention devoted to the Palestinian communities in the city as well. And there's very little that actually examines these communities alongside one another and the points of intersection that bind them. And so what we find is that overwhelmingly Israelis and Palestinians, they want to lead normal lives, they want to build homes for themselves in Germany, in Berlin, but there's always a sense of longing for home, one's original home, whether it's Israel or Palestine.
Now, theoretically, we grounded our work in various philosophical and ethical models of moral responsibility, inspired among others by Noam Chomsky's book, The Fateful Triangle, which was published in 1983, in which Chomsky examines the relationship between the US, Israel, and of course, the Palestinians. And also by Michael Rothberg's more recent study on multidirectional memory, remembering the Holocaust in the age of decolonization, which was published in 2009, where Rothberg describes what he terms competitive memory, basically meaning that we all somehow fear that recognizing someone else's trauma could somehow dilute attention to our own trauma. And it is basically this theoretical frame that shaped our single most important question, which simply put is Germany's and Germans' moral responsibility towards Israel, the Israel-Palestine conflict, Israelis, Palestinians in the Middle East, and also more specifically those who live in Berlin or in Germany more generally.
So when we think about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in our book, we really think about these phenomena in conversation with each other. We really think about how these are both forms of racism and are both systems of oppression, and that we need to name and resist anti-Semitism, we need to name and resist Islamophobia, and they're actually intimately connected. And even for our Palestinian Christian interviewees, they're often read as Muslim. They also have to contend with Islamophobia as well, even though Palestinians are both Christian and Muslim. So this is also linked to anti-Arab racism or anti-Turkish racism, anti-Middle Eastern sentiments as well. And we know that these forces of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia can be quite violent. So for example, last February, 10 people were murdered at a shisha bar in Germany. And in October of last year, there was a shooting at a synagogue. Both of these are very, very tragic events. We also know that statistically speaking, the vast majority of perpetrators of violent anti-Semitic and Islamophobic attacks in contemporary Germany are white Christian Germans. And so it is really essential that we understand these systems in this manner, and we try to do justice to that in the book. We also understand how it is that anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are intimately connected to the Holocaust and its legacies, as well as to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that continues through the present. So just as a quick example of this sort of relationship between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, we can think about the phenomenon of head coverings. So here there's an image from the Jewish Museum in Berlin, a really remarkable institution, and their rapid response exhibition that they put on featuring this kippah in the context of Germans in Berlin expressing solidarity with Jewish communities, wearing kippahs on their heads as a sort of response to a very public debate about an attack that happened in Germany, in which a young Syrian refugee attacked a young Syrian refugee who's originally Palestinian, attacked a young Palestinian in Germany who was wearing a kippah. So the Palestinian was not Jewish, but he decided to wear a kippah for one reason or another, and then he was unfortunately violently attacked by a fellow Arab, and this was caught on video and went viral and really shook the country, I think, in ways that are productive, but also quite disconcerting that these phenomena happen. And so the Jewish Museum Berlin responded in this way. But also our interviewees, our informants, our interlocutors who are Muslim or who are women who wear the hijab would talk about the fear that they experience in Berlin, worrying about being attacked physically because of their head coverings, worrying for their own physical safety and the safety of their children as well.
In our chapter on urban spaces and voices, we examine the urban landscape and both the visible and also less visible signs of the two migrant populations we examine. And also, of course, the question of how Israelis and Palestinians have integrated into German society. Is Berlin really the new promised land for Israelis? And does the city truly serve as a refuge for Palestinians? Do they feel home, welcomed, integrated? How do they identify? And how do they relate to their host country and culture? And of course, how does the host, the Germans, feel about these newcomers? Here, some of the Palestinian businesses, restaurants, and bars we visited, and some of the Israeli places in the city we went to. And here, very indicative of Germany's commitment to Israel, Berlin's Brandenburger Tor, as it was lit up with the colors of the Israeli flag in January of 2017 to show solidarity with the 4 Israeli soldiers murdered by a Palestinian truck driver. Now, there are no parallel signs of official solidarity with Palestinians or Palestine, but we do see the Palestinian flag all over the city, that is in the neighborhoods with high concentrations of Palestinians. Here, for example, a picture we took of Café Farouz in Neukölln, the flag hung from a balcony. Here on the left, a photo of Café Hanzala, also in Neukölln, with an image of Jerusalem's Dome of the Rock. And to the right, you see Café Bulbul, which actually displays an image of Hanzala, which basically has become a very popular symbol for Palestinians around the world. Hanzala is featured as a young barefoot refugee boy with spiked hair, whose back is turned to the viewer, and the message is basically that he does not grow and his face will not be seen until Palestine is free. So there are really lots of signs in Berlin's urban landscape that signals the country's relationship with Israelis and Palestinians. One, however, is mainstream and official, and the other is vernacular and formal. Here, for example, an ad we photographed. It says, "Zwei sonnige Städte, eine Reise, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem." And here, graffiti under an overpass in Kreuzberg reading, "Freiheit für Palästina." We did see lots of security for all synagogues and Jewish institutions throughout the city. Here we participated in a Shabbat service at the Frenkelufer Synagogue, which is known to have the highest number of Israelis. In fact, not too many are observant, not too many among the Israelis who come to Berlin. There's a small minority who are observant. We also visited the Dar es Salam Mosque during a Friday prayer, which is known to attract the highest numbers of Palestinian Muslims. They also attend other mosques in the city, but this is proportionately, this is where they have the highest participant numbers. There was a comparative lack of security. Now the intention, at least following the recent event in Hanau, is to change that. And a formal Expertenkomitee was formed not so long ago to address these kinds of incidents as well. Now, while we did make sure to include the voices of Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians from really all walks of life with really a range of political view, we did decide to highlight a select number of very prominent Israelis and Palestinians who live in Berlin. Here on the left, we see Daniel Barenboim, photography, film, and installation artist Yael Baltana at the Volksbühne, and in-house director at the Maxim Gorki Theater on the right, Yael Ronen. And what is interesting is that, like the majority of Israelis who live in Berlin, they're all openly critical of Israel or of Israeli right-wing politics. Now, the media tends to highlight mostly criminal incidents among Palestinian populations. And interestingly, even most of the scholarship on Berlin's Palestinian community is primarily interested in their background as refugees. And there's not too much interest in highlighting successful Palestinians. Here on the left, we see world-renowned Palestinian pianist Salim Ashkar, who lives in Berlin, but who has a significant international career. At the center, we see Tarek al-Turk, a Palestinian refugee who came from Syria, originally from the Gaza Strip, who moved to Berlin in 2015, along with many others. Many other refugees from Syria. He's a dancer, acrobat, and actually he's sometimes referred to as the Arab Spider-Man. We see him here on this picture floating on one of Berlin's high-risers. And finally, on the right, we see politician Sausan Chebli, who's currently state secretary for federal affairs in the Berlin state government of Mayor Michael Müller.
So we were tremendously inspired by the points of intersection between Israelis and Palestinians that the city of Berlin and spaces in Berlin actually facilitate. So this is an image from the Shalom Salam initiative, which brings together Jewish individuals and Muslim individuals, including Israelis and Palestinians, on joint initiatives responding to anti-Semitism, responding to Islamophobia, speaking about head coverings in the public domain. And this is an example of the Circle One Gallery in Berlin that we actually visited. And when we visited, there were actually two exhibitions happening simultaneously. One was an Israeli artist. You can see him on the top without the shirt. And it's this several seconds breath exercise, artistic platform, really thinking about Israelis who have to deal with rocket fire attacks in Israel from Palestinian militant groups and sort of like catching their breath. It was a very powerful display. And then you see below the display of a Palestinian artist who was exploring themes of circumcision and religion and politics and othering and racism, and how these issues came together in a very powerful way. And then this is the Daniel Barenboim and Edward Said, the Barenboim Said Academy in Berlin, which is an amazing space. The late Palestinian intellectual Edward Said once said, Palestinians are the victims of the victims, the refugees of the refugees. And then Daniel Barenboim is a very prominent Israeli musician, and the fact that this institution exists in Berlin and brings young musicians from all over the Middle East, including Israelis and Palestinians, and is also supported by the German government, we found as an incredibly inspiring and hopeful space. And this is Kainan, a restaurant that we visited in Berlin that boasts having the best hummus in town. I'm not sure it's the best, but that's what they say, but it was fabulous. We really enjoyed it. And it's owned by a Palestinian Christian owner and a Jewish Israeli owner who came together and created this establishment. And Israelis, Palestinians, and many others visit for some Middle Eastern food.
Our chapter called Between Guilt and Censorship focuses on German guilt for the Holocaust, how it very often frequently translates into both support for Israel of Jews, and also into the silencing of Israel criticism. It also engages the experience of numerous Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians who feel censored when it comes to speak openly about Palestine, and also specifically the taboo of criticizing Israel. And we do include a number of incidents we read about, and also some we actually witnessed directly, where boycotters were boycotted. Yes, it is a strange concept, but an ironic reality in present-day Germany. We see here 3 human rights defenders, Christoph Glanz, Judith Bernstein, and Amir Ali, a German, an Israeli, and a Palestinian, who are actually currently suing the German parliament over their anti-BDS resolution. Or here, an event that actually took place this past month in October, a couple of weeks ago, was organized by a group of Jewish Israelis at the Weißensee Kunsthochschule, which is an art college here in Berlin. And the organizers refer to themselves as Beit HaSefer LeUnlearning Zionut, School for Unlearning Zionism. And the school was actually pressured to withdraw its funding. It wasn't very much, it was €100. And then various statements were made that some of the involved individuals or organizers had links to the BDS movement. And this then created a whole mess on social media and the college, and also beyond. And one of the teachers involved in this project, Professor Matthias Jude, commented on this and was quoted in one of the articles reporting on this. And this quote very much underlines the whole awkwardness of these kinds of repeated incidents. And he said, "It is very problematic to cancel the events by claiming they violate the anti-BDS resolution, because that resolution states explicitly that you cannot cancel Jewish events." And all of this, of course, postdates the time frame we cover in our study, but I would say they are all highly representative of the issues we engage in this very last chapter of our book.
So just to conclude, we are deeply committed to restorative justice. And when we think about this moral triangle between Germans, Israelis, and Palestinians, we are so deeply moved by the efforts towards restorative justice that we see between Germans and Israelis. They're just fantastic. And also, it's incredible to see the on the other side of the triangle, the Israeli-Palestinian side, so many efforts towards restorative justice. But what we find, which is very striking, is it's that third part of the triangle, the German-Palestinian relationship, that's actually in need of the most healing in terms of restorative justice, and where more bridges need to be built. And so the kindness and compassion that Germans and moral responsibility they've extended to Israelis are to be lauded, and we applaud that. And we hope that in the future that same compassion and kindness can also be extended to Palestinians in the city, in the country, and beyond as well. And so thank you again, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation of your book. I had the pleasure to meet these two researchers while they were doing their fieldwork in Berlin. And now I see the published book and had the pleasure to read it. It's each time I read it, I see a different angle. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. So I have a few questions related to the writing process of the book. And I'm also seeing some questions on the Q&A coming up. So I will take about 20 minutes for the Q&A part. For those who came later to this session, I can't see the blue hands. I will just take, and I also cannot see some of the names who is asking which question, but I see the questions and I will read it for you. So my first question goes to Kati. As we know, the last two nights, the 10th and the 9th and 10th of November, we remember the Kristallnacht. You write about your family's experience during the Holocaust. Your father survived Auschwitz, and most of your family died in the camps. I was very touched about how this shaped your life. Your upbringing in Germany, the fact that you left after high school and you moved to Israel and became an Israeli citizen. So can you a little bit tell me about how this informed your background, informed how you developed your scholarship, and especially the book that you wrote together with Said?
Sure. Thank you for your question, Götke. Well, in some ways, I left Germany as a German Jew, as a Zionist Jew, and I returned to Berlin as an Israeli Jew 30 plus years later. And I believe it is because of my family history and the fact that I grew up in Germany that shaped my very strong identity as a Jew, and also my continued interest in and commitment to everything Jewish, Jewish history, Jewish art, Jewish archaeology, Jewish religion, culture, and of course, Israel-Palestine, and really everything that relates to the region's history, and of course, also the ongoing conflict. And though I had really never been interested in writing about Germany, and certainly not anything about the Holocaust, when I returned to live in Germany in the spring of 2016, I felt that something had changed, and that really made an impression on me, and also shook me up in good ways and in bad ways. And of course, there is a difference between Berlin and Düsseldorf, where I grew up, and of course, I changed and I certainly matured, at least I would hope so. But I was deeply touched by the way Germany had changed, in particular with regard to how it deals with its dark past. I feel that compared to many other countries and even other cities within Germany, Berlin has this very intense and very sincere commitment to deal with the Holocaust and its consequences. And I think in many ways our co-authored book is about Germany's Vergangenheitsbewältigung, how it has achieved a great deal over the course of the last few decades, but also where it has failed. And of course, in some ways, this book is also a little bit about our Vergangenheitsbewältigungen. Saed's and mine. And I would say that rather than looking at Berlin and Germany as most German Jews would do, I now see Germany as most Israelis who come to Berlin. I tend to be, with all modesty, to be more knowledgeable with regard to Judaism than most German Jews. I think I'm like most Israelis. I'm also more informed and up to date with regard to the history of Israel-Palestine. And perhaps most importantly, like most Israelis who live here or spend some time here in Berlin, I'm critical of Israeli right-wing politics and also very sensitive to Germans and Germany's definition of Israel criticism, very, very often equating Israel criticism with anti-Semitism. And this is something I found I shared with many Israelis we interviewed, this hurt of being defined or called out as anti-Semitic by Germans, who I think sometimes feel very stuck in their own anxiety or stiffness when it comes to protect Israel at all cost.
Thank you, Kati. I want to ask my second question to Saed. One thing that also attracted my attention, that you integrate historical and ethnographic information in your book, and the historical and theoretical interventions are, for me, extremely interesting and very important. It's what I find the most amazing about the book are the voices of the people. You really give voices to people, and it's like you're touching them. It's really fascinating, beautifully written. As I was reading the book, it's like, oh, I know this person. Of course, you change the names and everything, but it felt like I know them in person. And but one thing that really attracted my attention, and really I appreciated it, the broad scope of people that you interviewed. I live in Berlin for 11 years, and you know, it's amazing how many people you got in touch with. Germans, Israelis, Palestinians, with and without education, with people from the left, center, from the right. And you did not also shy away from citing them in your book. There, I can see anti-Semitic, Islamophobic, or even racist voices. So can you give a few examples of encounters that demonstrate the kind of interactions you had with these people?
Yeah, thank you, Gökçe. And you know, I am an anthropologist, and for Kati and myself, ethnography was really important, and bringing those voices to life was a critical part of our intervention in the book. And I'm happy to share some examples. I don't want to, I hope folks can read the book and read more of the examples, but just a few that come to mind. So I'll just share a little bit about examples of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and how our respondents responded to questions regarding these issues and how they're linked together. So, for example, we spoke with one AfD supporter who was very frustrated with Angela Merkel. She actually called her mother. She said she's trying to be Mother Teresa, and then she said she's bringing all of these Israelis and all these Jews into Germany, and they're taking over the country, and they now control the country. And then she said, and she's bringing in millions and millions of Muslims who are destroying the country and taking our jobs and everything. So, you know, Kati and I are very polite, very gracious. And there was one.
Saed, if I may interrupt you just for a second. So this was one of these wonderful spontaneous encounters during a cab ride.
Yeah. There was one individual who was a German, a young German, and when we asked how the person defines anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, they said that Islamophobia is fear or hatred of a group of people, Muslims, and that anti-Semitism is hatred of a state, the state of Israel. That was the understanding of what anti-Semitism was. That's how they defined anti-Semitism. We found that utterly fascinating. There was a Israeli man in the tech industry with whom we spoke who said that anti-Semitism is totally irrational, doesn't make any sense. because it's fear and hatred of a people for no reason that's totally unjustified. But he said, whereas Islamophobia is grounded in reality, it's actually very much justified. And then he said, you know, when you look at Israel-Palestine, look, the Israelis have made the desert bloom, they've created a democracy, whereas what have the Palestinians contributed to humanity and civilization? All they do is throw rocks and export hatred. So, you know, I'm sitting there, he knows I'm Palestinian, and I'm staying very calm. And it was really wonderful to have Kati there because we really supported each other during some of these painful moments. And I think that the last example I'll share, there was an Israeli woman in Berlin who was so thoughtful, and it captured the complexity and the nuance the richness that we tried to convey in the book. She said, I so wish that Germans would be willing to speak up more regarding Israel, to be more, to be more courageous in terms of their criticism of the state, of the military. But then she said, at the same time, I admit that it makes me deeply uncomfortable when I hear them do that as a Jewish Israeli. So she's torn. On one hand, she wants to see more Germans speaking out, but at the same time, she admits that it's still very painful for her to have to endure that. And this is not a black and white issue, and we try to convey that.
Thank you. Actually, you answered one of the questions in the chat. The questions are like raining to the chat right now. So I won't be able, I apologize, I won't be able to take all the questions, but I'm taking, for example, this one, which I know, because I know Kati is working on a book about Jewish women, and that's also her new project. So this is also combining this book and the upcoming book. The question is like this: I was curious as to what your thoughts are as relates to some of these issues being engaged with in the mainstream media, such as in the Netflix series Unorthodox. Granted that Unorthodox does not directly deal with Palestinian apex of the triangle. Put differently, does the engagement of some of these issues by the mainstream media and entertainment culture have a significance?
I'm trying to see the question. It's a long question.
Yes.
I saw.
It's at 8:20.
Actually, yes, I do think that movies and series can very much shape the public. And I particularly was not very keen on this series. It had some beautiful, strong aspects, but all in all, I personally was a little bit disturbed by the fact that it was shown to an audience that is perhaps not always able to contextualize the sect that was featured in this movie. And so the specific sect that was featured there is one that is quite extreme, and I think it is a shame to really focus on one exclusive sect without really having a better understanding of Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Judaism. And then also I find it very awkward to then bring the woman running away from the suppressive context and coming to Berlin, and Berlin is really her savior. And I think Berlin and the music school there was featured as being this multicultural haven, which it is to some extent. There are some enclaves, but there's still a lot of segregation. I mean, we've met with many Germans who said that they don't like to go to Neukölln, and or Israelis and Palestinians who find it awkward that Germans will find anxious to go to neighborhoods in which they live. Another example, perhaps from the popular media, which we do not discuss in our book, is another series I was very disturbed by. It was called Dogs of Berlin, also a Netflix series. And this series instead focused on the Palestinian community that came as refugees primarily from Lebanon. And I was, first of all, I didn't like the series very much, but I was also surprised that nobody seemed to be offended by the fact that there was no redemption for these Palestinians that were featured. They were just the bad criminal guys. And there was clearly an effort to deal differently with the Turkish population, which could be either bad or, in fact, the hero of the series was a Turkish policeman. And I think that's another example how sometimes populations are featured in the popular media, and they're decontextualized, and without explaining what is happening in a specific series, I think it can have quite a bit of impact, and I think it can be problematic.
Yes, thank you. There are two questions on the same topic, so I would like to take that about the East German memory politics. And there, since two people are insistently asking the same question, I read that, did the memory of the GDR and its politics related to this topic play any role for your interviewees, or has it become irrelevant? I think this is an interesting question. Who, Saad?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, this split, between East and West in the German context, and the different configurations of, relationships to the Soviet axis, or relationships to the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and to Israel, etc., and how that's changed over time, and the unification of the country and dissolving of the Berlin Wall. I mean, all of this is so powerful. All of this is so salient, and I think in many ways it haunts these communities in the present. But I think now in 2020, when we were doing our research in 2018, I don't think it's as salient in terms of the forefront of people's consciousness. That didn't really emerge as a significant theme in what folks shared in our ethnographic engagement with them. But we do address some of those questions actually in the book, in the historical context.
Yeah. Also, let's don't give many spoilers. I know that some of the questions are answered in the book, so perhaps I will let them read the book, but there are also interesting questions that has not been responded before. For example, there is one: the Israeli population in Berlin includes many people who see themselves as dissident Israelis in some ways. You mentioned this also in the talk a little bit, but perhaps I would like to probe this a little further. Even if they're committed to an Israeli identity, they were also outsiders in Israel for political, gender, sexual reasons. And they're almost all critical of Israeli right-wing politics. How does this shape relations with German Jews and Russian Jews in Berlin? What about Palestinians? It seems to me they are less critical of the Palestinian establishment, but this could be my ignorance, says the participant.
That's actually a good point, that yes, left-wing Israelis are in the minority in Israel, and left-wing Israelis, even though we did not conduct a quantitative study, so we don't have clear statistics, but we do. We did read other people's scholarship, and there are a number of other significant studies that have been conducted on the Israeli migration to Berlin. And so, yes, it does seem that the majority of Israelis who come and settle in Berlin are critical of the Israeli government. So here they're the majority. In Israel, they are among the minority. And so this question about their relationship with the Jewish community is actually a very interesting one, because there is very little overlap. For the the majority of Israelis don't interact with the Jewish community. And this is actually a little bit ironic because the Jewish community in Germany, which is largely 90%, I think, is originally from Russia, and they tend to be very right-wing. And so there's this irony because most of the Jewish Germans who live here tend to be very pro-Netanyahu, very right-wing, very supportive of Israel. And there's this general happiness among German Jews and among Germans that there is a revival of Jewish life because of the Israeli migration. The numbers went steeply up. The Jewish community in Berlin has grown significantly over the last few years, and the irony is that they're excited, but they're also very critical of these Jews, and they don't have much in common. It's really two different cultures, two different groups.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you.
And perhaps there was also the question if left-wing Israelis here interact with Palestinians. I wouldn't say all of them, I wouldn't even say half of them, but many do come together in various institutions and various projects. They live in the same neighborhoods, or at least some of the neighborhoods have large concentrations of Israelis and large concentrations of Palestinians. We have met a few that are actually in relationships with the other community, and or live together in an apartment, share an apartment. Mm-hmm. So there's definitely many more spaces here in Berlin than there are in Israel or in the West Bank and in the Middle East.
Yes, thank you. I have one question to Saed, because and it's about gender. The last question also had a gender and sexuality component, and this is a subject that we all share, that we are all interested in. You just published Queer Palestine, and as I mentioned, Carrie is writing a book on Jewish women and gender, and it's also my research area. Although gender is not in the core topic of the moral triangle, it comes up in numerous passages in the book, which I find very intriguing and touching, especially your experience with the gay community in Berlin, which was not always positive. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, issues of gender and sexuality, I think, are near and dear, like you said, Gökçe, to all three of our hearts. And for me, it's very personal as a gay person, but also as a researcher in this domain. And while our book is not explicitly about gender and sexuality, it does emerge, I think, by the end of the text as an important theme. And what I found was really striking is that Berlin is such a cosmopolitan and also queer city. I mean, I've been to many cities around the world, and probably Berlin is my favorite in this respect. I mean, it truly encompasses the LGBTQ community in such a powerful way. And I love all of the different subgroups within the LGBTQ community and the kind of heterogeneity that's there. And the fact that the Gay Pride Parade attracts, over 1 million people annually. This is incredible. And it's also surreal to think about this transition from the Weimar era and the establishment of the leading queer social movements in the world in the early 1900s emerging from Berlin. And then you have the Nazi era where queer bodies were systematically targeted for erasure, which is absolutely devastating. But then now you have this amazing revival of queer life in the city. That was truly incredible. One of the things we found was, going back to the Gay Pride Parade that happens in Berlin, a number of people talked about how stickers with the Israeli flag are systematically circulated at these Gay Pride Parades, and how Israel is sort of singled out at the Gay Pride Parades as a debate, and that people should wear the Israeli flag stickers on their bodies. And then people have this conundrum. They don't really know what to do with that sticker. You know, some of them throw it away. Some of them don't want to throw it away because it has the Star of David on it and they want to be respectful. They don't want to contribute to anti-Semitism. Others are repulsed by it because they feel it's a symbol of a right-wing government and its ultra-nationalist policies and military occupation. Others are proud to receive it and display it very prominently and want to wear the Israeli flag in solidarity. But so many LGBTQ people have to face Israel-Palestine becomes a major part of their lives, even as queer people and as these debates unfold. And I'll finally just recommend a resource which is fantastic. Hila Amit is a young Israeli scholar who's now living in Berlin. She has a great book called A Queer Way Out, where she sort of looks at the history of queer migration from Israel to Germany and specifically to Berlin. So I highly recommend her book.
Thank you. I will check that out. There are a lot of questions in the chat still. I'm sorry, I don't have time for reading all the questions. Some of them are really interesting. A lot of people are thanking you for this amazing presentation. I'm going to now give the word to Daniel. I'm running out of time, but I really enjoyed discussing this book with you and moderating the chat.
Thank you.
Goethe, thank you so much for the great job you did questioning our distinguished visitors and moderating the Q&A. This has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. And what can I say? I hope this is the first installment of a larger conversation that we will continue to have at the American Academy when we can discuss again in person and have it online so that we can have the kind of terrific audience that we have had tonight, which has people joining us from all over the world. This has been tremendous. Let me just say in closing that we have 2 more events coming up at the Academy that may be of interest. And so we'll do a public service announcement here tomorrow, November 12th at 7:30 p.m. Berlin time. Ayanna Mathis, who some of you will know is the author of the 2012 bestseller, The 12 Tribes of Hattie, will be reading from her new novel in progress, which is entitled A Violent Woman. Ayanna is a fall 2020 Berlin fellow who unfortunately could not join us here because of the current travel restrictions, but we're looking forward to this, and she will do it virtually from the US. On November 24, also at 7:30 local time, our Holtzbrinck fellow, Mosi Secret, will be giving a talk entitled Visions of Tolerance, the 1960s Experiment to Desegregate the Boarding Schools of the American South. Mosi is an alumnus of the New York Times. He's an investigative journalist. He's currently with us at the Academy, one of the few who could get in because of his lovely Danish wife who helped him get across the border. And he is working on this narrative history of a really remarkable philanthropic experiment that began in the 1960s to integrate elite schools in the South. If you would like to attend Mosi's talk or Ayanna Mathis's reading tomorrow, please go to our website, www.americanacademy.de, and look under upcoming events, and you can register there. And once again, I want to thank our speakers tonight for a really fascinating presentation. The book is tremendous. I will show it once again. I know you're supposed to. I know Oprah does that all the time, so I'll do it too. And thank you all so much for joining us. And I hope you have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.